I want to first of all recognize that we're on the ancestral homeland of the Duwamish, the Muckleshoot, and other coastal Salish tribes, and it's very important to recognize that. This is a tradition that I first saw at poetry readings in British Columbia, and I was delighted to see it catch on here, as done at Margin Shift, as done at UW Bothell, and other places. So it's very important to recognize that. It's also very important to recognize when I'm going on so I don't go over 307. This is impressive. The quality of human being in this room is impressive, and I'm delighted to be part of it. I shouldn't be surprised because it's centered around Jason, and he does things in that way. So I'm going to talk about my take on Cascadian Zen by discussing a 20-year bioregional cultural investigation that the nonprofit that I founded in 1993 is engaged in. We're about year 7 of a 20-year investigation of the bioregion called Cascadia. This is the website, splab.org, and if you go to Cascadian Zen, you'll see basically the program on there. And that little link right there, PDF. So if you want to go back to it later, that's where you find it, splab.org/Cascadian Zen. So I already opened up the PDF, and here we go. Splab.org, Cascadian Zen. And SPLAB is Seattle Poetics Lab, founded 14 December 1993, originally to create public affairs radio programs. And we created over 450 hours of interviews that soon aired weekly on 18 stations. King FM, KZOK, The Mountain, KGON Portland, Village 900 in Victoria, and other stations. And as these interviews were specific non-entertainment public affairs programming. I mean, basically the opposite of what we have in radio right now. And as I began to do them, I started to get very interested in whole systems approaches. A couple years ago, we gave our archives to the White River Valley Museum in Auburn, Washington. And all these old reel-to-reels and CDs, reel-to-reels, when they get old and start to disintegrate, to get the audio off of them, they have to literally bake the reels in an oven, and I think it's 100 degrees. So we said to the museum, they're yours to have. But over 450 hours of programming, and if you click on this link, listen, you can just go through basically the broadcast period. A few interviews after the area where we were syndicating the show, but you just go down and down and down and down and down and down, and it just keeps going on. It's a lot of programming that we've done over the years. So the links are there in the presentation. Some of the interviews that I did over the years were collected in a book called American Prophets. You can see the book over there. Interviews with people like Wanda Coleman and Michael McClure and Allen Ginsberg. Also non-poets like Rupert Sheldrake, Richard Atleo, a hereditary chief of the New Chotenoth tribe, Clayoquot Sound, which on the map of Cascadia would be right about there. And the interview with him was really interesting about the vision quest that comes from his culture. So that book came out in time for our 25th anniversary just over a year ago. One of the interviews that I did before we started syndicating the program gives you a sense of where I was headed early in my career as an interviewer. And it was with Peter Berg, who founded the Planet Drum Foundation, April 12th, 1992. And more than any other human being, Peter Berg is responsible for this concept that we know as bioregionalism. And it's weird to hear my voice. I wonder if, is there going to be sound coming? We didn't check the sound. I wonder if the sound's going to come out. That's going to be, well, we'll soon find out. I'll click on it and see what happens.
To take the concept of bioregions.
So that's the one thing in listening to these interviews is to hear my young voice, and it's just such a weird sensation. Anyway, I hope the volume's not too bad, but this is me interviewing Peter Berg on a program that aired in 1992.
To take the concept of bioregions further, would all what is necessary for survival come from that bioregion instead of importing meat from, say, Kansas City? Would we live off the area, basically?
Well, in order to answer, let's start with the imperative. The imperative is that we learn how to live in harmony with natural systems in sustainable ways. That means that the ways that we live would change. The kinds of things we would do to get basic human needs, such as food, shelter, water, and I would include culture in that, would be more adaptable to the place itself. And the imperative, if I could get back to that, is to live in sustainable ways. How can you do that if you're importing materials to your bioregion and exporting them as a primary activity? If you're primarily an importer and importer, say, of food, exporter of, say, minerals, then you're not going to be living in a sustainable way. So, starting from there, yes, one would look for the ways to live in terms of what's available in the bioregion itself.
So it's interesting that he said culture. It's important to note that that's part of living sustainably. And this is an iron bridge over the River Severn in Shropshire, England, opened in 1781. And Peter says that since that time, since that bridge was built, he uses that as the line of demarcation. You see the quote, Western consciousness has been dominated by the idea of taking natural systems apart for their ingredients and then reassembling the ingredients to make other things. This is a chemical trick that has been enormously powerful. I'm not going to say successful because the end product is garbage. The end product of the cars and refrigerators is a landfill or a dump. And he calls it soft shoe planet murder. And if you remember that he said he includes culture in that, then the implication is that the culture is garbage too. And probably don't have to belabor that point as we see who's running this country right now. So some of the poets that we've interviewed, and then as I started doing the interviews of whole systems, I started to realize the people for me who had the most juice were the poets. And so some of the poets that we've interviewed in those early years, Allen Ginsberg, Edward Miller, Michael McClure, Clarissa Pincola Estes, Nikki Finney, Diane DePrima, Victor Hernandez Cruz, Jerome Rothenberg, and so on and so forth. That was by 2005, and we continued to do interviews. This was a copy of a local magazine which chronicled the local lit scene back in the day, and we were doing a lot of work with youth, so we made the cover for that. What the water knows. This is an important thing to bring up. And got a picture of Sam Hamill there. I'm going to play his voice. But there's a picture of Sam with Bhakti Watts, my partner. Why did I choose this particular picture of Sam Hamill? Because it's Valentine's Day and my partner's here. And so instead of the romantic dinner, she came here to listen to me yap. I have the obligatory chocolates. But also... But inside there, in addition to the chocolates, if you just open that up real quick, you can see that there's a little tape. I don't know if it's taped back on. So this is a sidebar. Forgive this. It's Valentine's Day, so I had to do that. Anyway, there's inside there are. She got it together. Thanks, Sandra. Tickets to see Tuck and Patty on Monday. At the Triple Door. So that's, yeah, she already gave me the card, and I was wondering, she's thinking, is he going to give me anything? What's going on? Anyway, Sam Hamill, you talk about Cascadian poets, and Sam, of course, is a huge influence on me, an incredible teacher. I could probably do a whole presentation on just some of the lessons which come up all the time. Sam's perception of why people get involved in the poetry community. And so what I'm going to do is play this track of Sam doing this poem, What the Water Knows. And then I'll come back to the text, because I notice every time I click on it, it doesn't open a new tab. Anyway, here's Sam.
What the water knows. What the mouth sings, the soul must learn to forgive. A rat's as moral as a monk in the eyes of the real world. Still, the heart is a river pouring from itself. a river that cannot be crossed. It opens on a bay and turns back upon itself as the tide comes in. It carries the cry of the loon and the salts of the unutterably human. A distant eagle enters the mouth of a river salmon no longer run, and his wide wings glide upstream until he disappears into the nothing from which he came. Only the thought remains, lacking the eagle's cunning or the wisdom of the sparrow. Where shall I turn, drowning in sorrow? Who will know what the trees know, the spidery patience of young maple, or what the willows confess? Let me be water, the heart pours out in waves. Listen to what the water says. Wind, be a friend, there's nothing I couldn't forgive.
So I'll go back to the PDF and to the text here, and the notion of water is very important. I love the prophecy in it too. A distant eagle enters the mouth of a river, salmon no longer run. Right? Sam, if you remember if you were a Facebook friend of his in the last few years of his life, it's today's march in ecocide was his regular update. Oh my God. Anyway, in 2009, SPLAB moved from Auburn to Seattle, opened up a space in Columbia City right across from the PCC. Our sign is still on the building if you're ever there, free advertising, because I'm not getting a ladder and a screwdriver to take the cement screws out. But in 2012, in that space, we created the first Cascadia Poetry Festival. And that's the year we started a 20-year bioregional cultural investigation of Cascadia. We've produced Cascadia Poetry Fests in 2014 and 2016 in Seattle. In fact, in the auditorium in 2014 is where we had that. We had the small press fair in this hall, which was great, teaming up with Seattle U. In 2015, Wordstorm put it on, and we worked with them in Nanaimo, BC, and in 2017 in Tacoma, 2019 in Anacortes, and 2020 we'll be doing the fest at the Multiverse on San Juan Island, and I have bookmarks there. A tribute to the life and legacy of Robin Blazer and the practice of Cascadia, the practice of the self, which came out of the 2019 panel, Cascadian Zen. In fact, that's something that Thomas said. I wanted to know about the practice of Cascadia, and I thought, I do too. So you'll be up on the panel, and Jason will conduct that panel, and Daphne will be on the Blazer panel, and it's going to be a pretty remarkable occasion. So, and doing these fests, some important developments come, and as you're doing an investigation, hopefully you're getting some clues. In 2014, we had a panel called Innovations from Here. George Stanley was part of that panel. In fact, this room, the picture looks very much like the room that we're in. It's probably down the hall. I forget exactly what room it was. You can see how blown away Nadine Maestas was. She couldn't, oh my God. Stephen Collis, who, he's such a warrior for the environment that he was the subject of a slap suit. The Kinder Morgan sued him and used his blog writings against him in a court of law. And fortunately, he was able to get out of it. You can see the map of Cascadia, the same map, David McCloskey's map. Gene Huving, who started the poetics program at UW Bothell, the late Joanne Kiger, talking about the community they were both involved in San Francisco in the 50s and 60s. And George Stanley, who you can go to the cut, that's where it says part of the panel. And I'll just let you go to that if you wanted to see a direct link to the panel. But he talked about, innovation. What do we mean by innovation? And he said that in North American poetry there was modernism at 1912, Ezra Pound, and there was the New American Poetry circa 1960. And how would we make it new now? Well, you have to understand what the situation is. And he said that contemporary poetry has the tyranny of irony. So to make it new, we had to make it true. And it was his idea to name it this. And I want to read his blurb on the back of this, and you'll get some sense of what he was talking about. And this book was launched in Nanaimo in 2015. Reading over these poems, I think younger poets in particular may be moving past irony, past writing that conveys no more than a cynical, tongue-in-cheek, or superior attitude, and writing more straightforwardly about the realities and conditions they believe need to be addressed in this world. So that's George Stanley talking about this book, talking about the material in this book about 5 years ago. And by the way, this was published by Leaf Press in Lanceville, BC. So it's a really bioregional project. Barry McKinnon also provided a blurb, and this will give you more sense of the content, I think, or at least our take on this. If the word subject is still in the postmodern lexicon, I believe the poet's subject is time, and that language discloses the actualities therein. Emotion is the poem's fact. Herein, then, the Cascadia poets, in the reality of their time, their actualities, writing in the necessary task of what language and emotion reveals. Very articulate. So there's Make It True, and there's the blurbs. And there's the cover. This is from Nanaimo. If you go under the bridge in Nanaimo, you can see that, which is pretty cool. And so I'm going to read a poem from this book, one of my contributions to the book. And this is called The Day the Weather Decided to Die. It's a haibun in a series of poems I wrote called Haibun de la Serna. All of the epigraphs in the book come from Ramon Gomez de la Serna. And this is after a Haida tale told by Robert Bringhurst. Epigraph: on hearing the wooden rumble of thunder, we realize that we are situated below the platform of the sky, the day the weather decided to die. What constitutes a good family, they say, and give instructions to servants under the backdrop of the hugest sucking sound in history, prelude to when the wind did no longer rumble from under the skirt of the great Ma, no longer float a blue heron's hacho-side lumber, no longer sustain. Age of celebrity tattoo news, of the rise of Yurok, Duwamish, Tsimshin, Haida, Puyallup, Muckleshoot, Musqueam, of tornadoes, hurricanes, earthquakes, tsunamis, bee silence, Fukushima, and Fukushimas to come. The weather born out of cockleshell embryo or out of snot. Weather that hunts birds and sends winds out in the skins of blue jay. Weather that steals hats of campesinos, compassions for kicks. Weather that would sprout houses when adopted by a master carver. Weather that would be a scholar of carving. The weather, when painted, would sit facing the sea, would weep for owls with spots in the new northward range of Dolphin's neighborhood. Weather that would warn of the big ones who think of biting. Weather whose big fish story is dried halibut and waits and waits and waits for a shift in settler rituals. It could start with today is a good day to die. Could start with the inheritance of the campesino, compression, who opened up about his daily prayers for humility, or when he, the one born in a cockleshell, would dress as wren and sit way above the sea as a cumulus cloud, waiting to see what his latihan would bring. Dance, song, chant, or something more cathartic just beyond his outstretched wings. Remember, crows your brother, stumps never lie. We hold up the sky. The notion that it could be born out of snot comes from the Nuu-Chah-Nulth people, and a direct reference to a boy that's born out of that. And if you think about that, and you think about DNA, you think maybe they weren't so far off. That's the day the weather decided to die. Other anthologies that we've put out over the years include the postcard anthology, 56 Days of August. This comes from the annual Poetry Postcard Fest that SPLAB has been doing for 13 years. Next year is the 14th. Basically, you get on a list. You get a list of 32 addresses, including your own, around the 4th of July, and you have the end of August to write 31 poems to the rest of the people on your list spontaneously on a postcard and send it to them in the mail. Actually, they don't get it like that. They have to wait for it. Sometimes they don't get it. Sometimes we throw it out. It's like in a Costco circular, and it goes out. I didn't get your postcard. The fest has gotten to the point where you have 424 people from, I think, 5 different continents last year, and the writing, as if writing spontaneously to someone you never met on a postcard is not hard enough. A lot of people are now creating their own cards. And of course, you can go to the next level and worry about the quality of your handwriting or the calligraphy, which is where I'm stuck. I've got to work on that. One of the other, and so Popo, as the fest is sometimes known, encourages spontaneity, seriality, and community. It's interesting to see, after 31 poems, what kind of themes have been going. A couple of years ago was the theme of breathing the ash from ancient forests, because they were coming from British Columbia and central Washington and landing in spider webs around our house. So, what are the other anthologies? Oh, and yes, Make It True meets Medusario, which we put out at last year's fest, which is a bilingual anthology of Spanish and English, taking some Cascadian poets and translating them into Spanish, and some Spanish poets from the Neo-Baroque tradition, translating them into English. And it's interesting, you go in the book, and if it's a Spanish poet, the Spanish is left and English right, and the other way for Cascadian poets. So that book is over there. And then the Samthology, a tribute to Sam Hamill, which we put out last year. Samthology was Ian's idea. Yeah, there's Make It True meets Medusario. So a little bit on the poetics of the Seattle Poetics Lab. As I was developing this presentation, I was halfway through and I realized, I've already kind of done that. I did this post a few years ago called Writing or Rewriting, and that's an active link if you go to the PDF. And so I'm going to go into some of the things. And we just had a board retreat, so we hashed out a lot of our poetics. And I was talking earlier about the camp. So this is a very Cascadian thing. 1944, Glenn Cofield, a conscientious objector in World War II, stationed at CPS 56 near Walport, Oregon, between Walport and Yachats. He was called the first hippie. I think that's pretty accurate based on that look. And he said he was interested in art as a crystallizing principle for determining which objects and situations are worth being concerned about. The Horned Moon in the Untied Press, Walport, Oregon, 1944. William Everson was also at that camp. And a lot of the energy of that camp went in San Francisco and became the San Francisco Renaissance. So if you go to Lewis and Clark in their Special Collections library, you can see some of the magazines, and it's really beautiful. And when he was told he had to report for duty, he was inducted. He says, yeah, okay, I'll be there in a couple of days. And he walked the 3-day walk. It was somewhere in the south, like in Arkansas or something like that. He says, I'll come in, but I don't think he told him I was going to walk in, but he did walk in. Our Poetics at Splab take off from the Poem as a Field of Action, which was an essay by William Carlos Williams in the Selected Essays, but delivered at the University of Washington in 1948 as a guest of Theodore Retke. And in that essay, he was wondering, if we're throwing out formal verse, what is the structure of the modern poem? Is there such a thing as free verse? He said, no, there isn't, because everybody's verse has certain tendencies, so to call it open form is more accurate. Projective Verse by Charles Olson, the subtitle Composition by Field. Of course, Olson was part of the 1963 Vancouver Poetry Conference, and that was only 13 years old. Projective Verse was only 13 years old when he was at that conference. He said in that essay, form is never more than an extension of content. He was quoting Robert Creeley. Denise Levertov would say, before she moved to Cascadia, form is never more than a revelation of content, which I think Olson would probably take as a friendly amendment, and I think is more accurate. To engage speech where it is least logical and least careless. And he says a whole flock of rhetorical devices, simile, metaphor, adjectives, drain the energy of the poem. The content does change when one writes projectively, and what stands toward reality brings such verse into being. This made me crazy because I knew in my soul that it was a whole systems approach. And when I read Shahar Brahm's book, written in Hebrew and translated into English, Charles Olson and Alfred North Whitehead, an essay on poetry, that was the holy grail for me, connecting those two things, the stance and the poetics. Levertov, 1965, some notes on organic form. We did a tribute to her at one of the fests and did a walk from the Seward house to her grave. And we also put a plaque at the house that she lived in Seward Park. I like to think of it as a very high-class tag, but you can see that at her place. Organic form, a method of a perception. She says such poetry is exploratory, and she also said most free verse is failed organic poetry, which I just love. And she also said in that essay, the condition of being a poet is that periodically a constellation of experiences demands or wakes in him. It was always him in 1965. We know this is, she meant the poet, but wakes in him this demand, the poem. The beginning of the fulfillment of this demand is to contemplate, to meditate, words which connote a state in which the heat of feeling warms the intellect, which I love so much. And she said to contemplate means not simply to observe, but to do these things in the presence of a God. And of course, remember it's 1965. Jason says, I would prefer, rather than the word God, we would say Buddha nature. So I see that as a friendly amendment. The Practice of Outside, Robin Blazer's essay, of course written in Cascadia, a very important essay. I have a blog post called Some Notes on the Practice of Outside. I'll get more into Blazer here in a second. George Bowering, lovely, welcoming figure that he is there, from Craft Slices. I don't know why he didn't reissue the book Craft Slices. Such a good book and clever name. I do not compose poetry to show you what I have seen, but rather because I have seen. This poet's job is not to tell you what it is like, but to make a poem. Not trying to use your poems to prove a point or address an argument. Not to try and control what the poems are doing, but rather be a kind of audience listening to where the poem is going to go. The practice of outside. Try to forget your own voice and listen hard for what the language is saying. You yourself are the audience, hearing a voice you've trained your ear to receive. Of course, seriality is very important to Splatt. Nate Mackey, one of the great practitioners of that. His two-pronged serial poem that's been going on for 35 or so years is one of the best serial things that's ever been done. And in the interview, one of the interviews I did with him, he talks about the appeal of serial form, the fact that things remain open. The well-wrought urn aesthetic imposes a certain sense of closure that he finds constricting. And he wanted to be the possibility of things coming into the poem that weren't necessarily resolved in that poem, weren't pursued to their fullest or most exhaustive. He wanted things to come into the poem that would have a life beyond that particular poem and would become part of an exploration that I'd be involved in my writing, he said. I asked him if it was negative capability, and he said yes, he agreed with that. And then Brenda Hillman, who was another Splab guest back in the day when we were in Columbia City, and we got her in Hillman City, so I thought it was good to get her under the sign there. Not that it was named after her, but we got a kick out of that. She has this essay called Eco-Poetics, Minifesto, a draft for Angie. It has 5 different parts. At times, a poem might enact qualities brought from romantic poetry, including complexity and contradiction. Such a poem employs knowledge from diverse disciplines, including scientific vocabularies. Its energies shuttle across binaries. Such a poem, like an animal, could graze or hunt in its time. The poem is its own action, performing practical miracles, the miracle of language roots, the miracle of perception, and so on and so forth. And F. And though powerless to halt the destruction of bioregions, the poem can be brought away from the computer. The poet can accompany acts of resistance so the planet won't die of the human. So bioregionalism plus poetry, deep eco-poetics is what I'm trying to say. One of the latest interviews I've done, the latest one that I've published, is with Miriam Nichols, another person on the bill for the next Cascadia Poetry Festival. And it was about this book, A Literary Biography of Robin Blazer, Mechanic of Splendor. And you can hear 2/3 of the interview. We did over 3 hours. For her to do 3 hours was pretty impressive, to be honest with you. And the quality of it as well is important. And one of the things, and you know, when I do an interview, I like to go through the book and make notes in the back, potential talking points. So I had quite a few. And this one, I certainly was going to ask her about, what do you mean poetry is noetic? I mean, I have an idea, but I asked her, and this is what she had to say. By the way, she wrote this book, she edited his collected essays, The Fire, she edited his last collected poems, and also a book of essays about his work. And so this is her on January 2nd at her apartment in Vancouver.
Robin thought all his life, never wavered on this, that poetry was a particular kind of knowing, that it was as valid in its way as all the other disciplines, as say biology, or psychology, or philosophy, and that it didn't erase, it didn't trump those other modalities, those other ways of approaching the world, but it was equally valid. You know, that it was a mode of knowing, and that without it, the human universe, if I could borrow that phrase from Olson, is incomplete. You're missing something. You're missing an important, element of the way that human beings are in the world, the relationality of how they are in the world. I always think about poetic knowing as relational thinking.
We followed that up in the interview, so if you want to see where it went or what led up to that, you can go back to that. And then I see that I'm just about out of time, so I'm going to try and get to the end of this here. There we go. So poetry is noetic. And she said there's a difference between Spicer's dictation, which is what he wrote about in the practice of outside, and writing spontaneously and engagement with other. The other is the unthought. It's what you don't know. It situates you in the world where your voice has to always be in intention with something that it doesn't know. I think that's the best way to think about it. So some thoughts about Cascadian Zen, closer to Asian and indigenous wisdom traditions than other bioregions. Wariness with traditional religions, SBNR, which of course is spiritual but not religious. My friend Beaver Chief said people come here for spiritual reasons. They think they come for a job or a relationship, but what's underneath is the call for individuation. What's very important here is the presence of water falling from above. That's how the Cascade Mountains got their name. That's how Cascadia, the bioregion, got its name. Not just waterfalls, but the near constant rain certain times of year, as anyone living here certainly can tell you about. Having grown up in Chicago, I think you don't have to shovel it, so it could be worse. And water equals compassion. I don't mean this literally. I mean water as a model for humans is compassion. And of course, the Buddhist scholars here can talk much more eloquently about that. But my feeling is that the call to be compassionate here is stronger than in other bioregions of North America because of the presence of water and the nature of it. Almost constant at this time of year, although today's a nice day. So that's my presentation, and I'd open it up to questions, comments, criticisms, rebuttals.
One at a time, please.
I'm also happy to sit down and eat Bhakti's chocolates too. She'll share any with me. Yes.
Thank you so much for all of this. It was coming at me so fast and furious. I was trying to keep notes, but I'm just wondering, is this on the website?
Yeah, if you go to Cascadian Zen, so splab.org/Cascadian Zen, and it's a page, so it's going to be pretty simple. This right here.
Oh, so it's actually in the it's okay.
It's
I thought that
PDF.
was the schedule itself.
Yeah, you can download my whole presentation.
Oh, fantastic.
I did it so I didn't have to drag my Mac here. He said there'd be a computer, so I just click on it. So yeah, you can see it there, and I'll leave that up as long as possible. Yeah, I was told when I did this that there was a lot of information coming out, and it was it's hard to kind of hang on to it, which is why I put it on online. So. And then the links are good too, they're hypertext. So you go right to the George Stanley panel, you go right to the Miriam Nichols quote and other things. The Peter Berg soundbite is on there as well. So, Sandra and then Daphne.
Can you say anything more about an essay on poetry by Whitehead?
This is by Shahar Brahm, B-R-A-M. It's a little book put out by Lewisburg University Press in Pennsylvania, written in Hebrew, of all things. And in it, he talks about Olson's Poetics and how much they're sourced in Whitehead. In fact, Projectiverse 2 was not released during Olson's lifetime because he thought it was just too derivative of Whitehead and wouldn't put it out. But Chax Press released it, the press that was in Tucson. I think they're still in Tucson, Charles Alexander's press. So the Whitehead scholars in this room could probably tell us a lot more about it. And
we have a very eminent Whitehead scholar.
that's fantastic. So, and I would love that for these threads to be followed. You know, I think it's kind of a synchronicity thing. Yes, Daphne.
I just wanted to say that is the fastest, most succinct history of the movement of poetry from the modern that I've ever heard.
Well, thank you for that. I think the fact that you're in the room makes this event even more special, and I'm really grateful that you're here. You know, when I say things like, you know, talk about history of the 1963 Vancouver Poetry Conference, you were there. I mean, you should be the one talking about it.
I was so young.
You know, but it's, I mean, for me, it's like I read about it, and it's a historical event. I mean, the movie they did starred you pretty much talking about it. If you haven't seen The Line is Shattered, about the 1963 Vancouver Poetry Fest, which I think continues to be the most seminal poetry event in the history of this bioregion. And you look at it and the content of it, it's mind-blowing to think that could have happened in one space, and the stories that come out of it are just remarkable. I loaned the DVD to Jason. Any other comments, questions? Yes, Thomas.
In your involvement with this adventure and odyssey, what has been the most personally surprising or revelatory insight or experience that you've had?
I don't know. I would have to think about that.
Don't think. I'm serious.
How organically I was led to all of this. And I think that, you know, if I go back to the PDF and, you know, you call it organic poetry, and people will, you know, they'll turn your nose, like, organic, you can't call it that. You know, you can't call it organic poetry. When I make these postcards, by the way, I cut out the little green organic symbol and I glue them onto the postcard. So Levertov was so prophetic in calling it that, and in the presence of a God is a little heavy-handed because, you know, that's a term that's out of use, but in the presence of divinity with the spirit of Buddha nature. And I think that's why, in part, we follow up these leads, like the lead that you said. You're on a panel called Cascadian Zen. The panel becomes a book. The panel becomes this event. You follow those leads as they come up, and they're dropped in your lap. And it doesn't really seem that hard if you put yourself in the right company. Putting yourself with someone like Jason Worth or anyone in this room, you just have to be smart enough to say, I've got to follow this lead. So everything has been very organic, and it's I feel guided and I feel blessed in that way, and I'm humbled that I was able to shut up for enough to follow these leads. So that is the thing that's, to me, that's surprising. And to find myself in the company that I've found myself, to interview Ginsberg when I was 32 years old. It's like, how the fuck did that happen? That's amazing. And then Michael McClure and Diana Prela and Ann Walden and blah, 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 blah. It's remarkable how someone with almost zero poetry knowledge in 1990 has gotten to the point where I could be sitting down and talking with people, and then getting to the point, this last interview, and you like to think your latest is always the best, but she is so remarkable, and how she did it 2 hours in one night, and you heard how eloquent she was. It's a real blessing. So that's what I would say. I'm kind of humbled that I've been put into a position where I've had access to the quality of information like this. Thank you.